In this lecture, I'm going to be giving a broad overview of ancient Egyptian religion, looking at what the Egyptians believed about their gods, the world, the human condition, and the afterlife. The Egyptians had an extensive pantheon of gods and goddesses. A pantheon is just basically all of the gods in their theology. Pantheon comes from a Greek word, pan, which means every, and then theon comes from the word theos, which means God. So all the gods that they believed in or acknowledged. Now, there's a lot of them, but you really only need to know the ones that I mention here. All right, the first one is Ra, also spelled R-E and pronounced Re. So I don't know which is the proper pronunciation. I'll try to stick with Ra, but I may lapse into Re from time to time. All right, Ra was the Egyptian word for the sun. So in Egyptian religion, Ra was the sun god. He was often envisaged as journeying across the sky in his solar bark. A bark is like a ship. He's easily recognized by his falcon head and the solar disk above it. He and the god Horus were assimilated into a single deity at some point. So you can see lots of pictures here. Sometimes he'll be depicted as having this double crown on his head, where it's the two different colored crown. That represents Upper and Lower Egypt. Ra was sometimes depicted as a man with 4 ram heads. These 4 heads represented the god's 4 manifestations. At morning, he was known as Khepri. This is the manifestation of the sun god at dawn. At midday, he was known as Horus, or just as Ra. And then in the evening, as the sun was fading in the west, he was known as Atum, kind of the elderly form of Ra. So let's look at each of these quickly. First of all, Khepri. Khepri was Ra's manifestation at dawn. He was depicted as a scarab, or a dung beetle, thrusting the sun disk up and out of the underworld, just as a dung beetle pushes its ball of dung across the ground. Here's a relief sculpture of the dung beetle thrusting the solar disk from the underworld into the eastern horizon. And here's another one. All right, and then at noon we have Horus, or just Ra. Here you see him depicted with his falcon head and the solar disk above it, or sometimes just as a falcon. And then sometimes you see the eye of Horus. By the way, if you're typing and you want to produce the eye of Horus, here's what you do. You type in this number, plus hold down the Alt key, and then X. The eye of Horus, as you can see, is kind of a stylized drawing of the hawk's eye, with this little line curving out to the left, which represents the coloring of the hawk's feathers, and then this other line coming down, that represents a teardrop, in order to recall when Horus's eye was injured. We'll talk more about that later. And then in the evening, the sun god turns into an old man. You can see him depicted as an old man here, and his name is Atum. He is envisaged as the setting sun, and therefore he's often depicted as an old man with a beard. He wears a double crown, symbolizing the rule over Upper and Lower Egypt, as I mentioned. He is also regarded as the creator god, although that may not seem very intuitive, at least if you're at all like me and you associate the morning with the beginning of things and the evening with the end of things. But in any case, he is the creator god, and he's often assimilated with Ra and referred to as Atum Ra, or Ra Atum. And then lastly, we have Osiris, who was the god of the underworld. Osiris is recognized iconographically by his funnel-shaped mitre. That's like a pope hat sort of thing. This mitre is decorated on both sides with ostrich feathers. Osiris also wears a white suit and has a mummiform body with green skin. He also holds a crook and a flail in his 2 hands, emblems of kingly authority. Now, I used to think that the green skin represented his dead body that was maybe being covered with gangrene or something. But if you read the pyramid texts, and if you look at a lot of the iconography of ancient Egypt, you'll see that green is symbolic of life. And so we have, for example, this utterance in one of the pyramid texts, "O you bowls of Atum, make Teti green, make Teti fresh." Fresh as in brought to life. This is the dead king, Teti, and the spell is designed to bring this dead Teti back to life. All right, you've probably heard of the discovery of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. Here you can see on Tutankhamun's sarcophagus that he is depicted as Osiris, holding a crook and flail in his two hands. As the chief god of the underworld, Osiris remains forever in the realm of the dead. His corpse does, at least. However, his Ba, and for now just think of that as his soul, does not remain in one location. During the day, it ascends into the sky in the form of the sun. So that's like Ra or Horus. Now, don't try to think too consistently here, because Osiris and Horus are actually two different gods, and yet somehow they're merged into one during the day. I'm not sure how exactly that was reconciled in the minds of Egyptians, or if they even cared to reconcile it. It just seems kind of like a contradiction to me. Anyway, the sun's underworld journey was not seen simply as a way for the sun to return back to the eastern horizon, where it would rise up again. It was also how Osiris's Ba would reunite with its corpse. This reunion of Osiris's Ba with his corpse was how the god's entire person and existence were maintained. See, because no single component of one's being could exist on its own, the Ba, this soul-like component of the person, needed the corpse, and the corpse needed the Ba. All of the components needed one another. And at death, all those components become separated. So the trick is to keep everything together somehow. And we'll talk about how that was done through the mortuary cult in just a bit. Now, the night journey through the underworld was quite treacherous. It was dark, and there were monsters, so it was very difficult to make your way through. And that's why the Ba of Osiris, depicted here as Horus, needed magical spells, so that he could be safely conducted through the underworld. In this painting, he's portrayed as journeying through the underworld on his solar bark and being protected by Seth, his uncle, who is fighting against the serpent Apep, or Apophis. And here's an interesting spell from one of the coffin texts titled "The Repulsing of the Dragon." It alludes to this nightly battle between Apep and the sun god Re. "I know that mountain of Baku, upon which the sky leans. On the east of that mountain is a serpent, 30 cubits in length, with 3 cubits of his forefront being of flint. I know the name of that serpent who is on the mountain. His name is He Overthrows. Now at the time of the evening, he turns his eye over against Re, and there occurs a halting among the solar crew, a great astonishment within the voyage, so that Seth bends himself against him. What he says is magic. Let me stand against you so that the voyage be set right. O you whom I have seen from afar, close your eye since I have bound you. I am the male. Cover your head so that you may be well, and I may be well. I am great of magic, and have used it against you. What is it? It is effectiveness. O you who goes on his belly, your strength belongs to your mountain. But watch me as I go off with your strength in my hand. I am one who lifts up strength. I have come just so I might plunder the serpent-formed earth gods. As for Re, may he be satisfied with me when we have circled the sky, while you, speaking of the serpent, are in your fetters. It is what has been commanded against the divine presence. Thus does Re set in life." All right, now I want to address a question about whether the Egyptians believed in a resurrection. Osiris's body remained in a mummified state, residing forever in the underworld. And so I think it would be inaccurate to say that Osiris was thought to have experienced a resurrection. at least in any usual sense that we use that term. Osiris, rather, was an archetype for what happened to other human beings at death. Corpses were mummified in order to prevent decomposition and destruction, but corpses were not expected to return to life or be resurrected. To say, then, that the Egyptians believed in a resurrection is to misunderstand or misuse a fairly well-defined concept in the study of religion. So look at these two utterances here from the pyramid texts. May your Ba, that's, remember, his soul, may your Ba ascend, may your corpse descend. Again, your Ba to the sky, your corpse to the netherworld. The next god we want to look at is Amun-Ra. Amun-Ra was another assimilation of the sun god Ra with a local deity. So just like with Atum-Ra, same thing, Amun-Ra. Originally, Amun was the patron god of the city of Thebes, but after Ahmose I drove out the Hyksos and became the supreme ruler, he decided to make Amun the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon. And so Amun and Ra were assimilated into a single deity. And this happened during the New Kingdom period, when the city of Karnak became the center of Amun-Ra's cult and temple. On this map you can see the cities of Luxor and Karnak, pretty close to Luxor. Here's a bigger map where you can see the city of Thebes and Luxor and Karnak, the two cities where there were especially well-known shrines to the god Amun-Ra. And then just north of there you had Abydos, where there was a temple, and also the Valley of the Kings, where a lot of the pharaohs were buried. And then further north you had Amarna. Remember, that was the city where Akhenaten dedicated his cult to the god Aten. And then further north were Saqqara, Giza, Heliopolis, and Tanis, all of those very important cities. Now, Amun-Ra was regarded as the king of the gods, and that was really for propagandistic purposes, because as king, he was able to make other kings. The way he would do that is he would transform himself into the image of the reigning pharaoh, and then go into the bedchamber of the queen, have sex with her, and the result of that union, in other words, the first male child that was born, would be designated the successor, the legitimate successor of the pharaoh, and the divine son of the god Amun-Ra. And so all of the pharaohs would be of divine stature because their father, Amun-Ra, was himself a god, and so that made them gods too. Now, as the king of the gods and the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon, Amun-Ra, of course, had numerous temple shrines, but the most important one was located at Karnak and Luxor. But here are the ruins of the one at Karnak. Here's a model of what it would have looked like, and some impressive statues and colonnades. Iconographically, you can always identify Amun-Ra because he's got that tall double crown. All right, moving on to Seth, also spelled Set. Seth was the brother and murderer of Osiris, and you can always tell which one is Seth because he's got the jackal's head. But you can sometimes confuse him with Anubis if you're not careful, because Anubis had a dog's head. But you can tell which one is Seth because he's got the two squarish ears sticking up. And then his staff is pretty distinctive as well. So again, Seth was the brother and the murderer of Osiris. He attempted to steal the throne from him. And so because of that, he also became the arch-rival of Horus, Osiris' son and presumptive successor to the throne. And Seth would become sort of like the archetype of any adversary to the Egyptians, and especially to the pharaoh. Any would-be usurpers to the throne, any foreign invaders, and so on. Seth was not always viewed in purely negative terms, however. He could also help to protect the king in the afterlife, apparently, as you can see from this vignette here. And then in this relief sculpture, he and Horus are jointly worshipping or perhaps installing Ramesses as king. On the other hand, you can see that sometimes he was viewed as an enemy, and in this relief sculpture, he has been erased. In other words, someone has chiseled out his image. This was a way to render a god or a person powerless in the afterlife, or whatever dimension of reality they were thought to exist in. The next god that we want to look at is Isis, the sister and wife of Osiris. Now you might say, well, sister and wife, what's up with that? Yes, incest was a thing in ancient Egypt, and in other parts of the world too. Pharaohs would often marry their own sisters. This was their way of keeping the royal bloodline pure, that is, within the family. Isis had a big role in the myth of Osiris. According to this myth, Osiris was slain by his brother Seth, and then hacked into several different pieces and scattered throughout the country of Egypt. Isis then transformed herself into a bird and went around and collected all of these body parts and brought them back together, reconstituted them in order to procreate with her now dead husband. It's kind of a bizarre myth, but we'll get into that more in just a bit. She was also the mother of Horus. Horus was the result of this union with her dead husband. Well, he was dead, but maybe not totally dead because his members still worked. All right, and Isis is depicted usually with this little backwards L on her head. And she had this distinctive staff as well, and an ankh, and her body looks more feminine as well, so she's pretty easy to identify. Sometimes, too, she would be depicted with the horned headdress of Hathor, the goddess of childbearing. So once again, we see this assimilation of one god into another, as we saw with Atum and Amun, who were both assimilated into the god Ra, and same thing with Horus. Isis was also seen as the great mother goddess. She was the patron goddess of marriage as well. Mythologically speaking, she was the mother and wife of the pharaohs. Now, once again, you might be thinking, mother and wife? That doesn't sound right. But you need to bear in mind that what we normally think of as distinct categories often get blurred in mythologies. So you have to bear that in mind sometimes. It just is what it is. All right, and Isis was also very famed for her magical abilities. For example, in one myth, she transforms herself into a young woman and tricks Seth into confessing that he was acting unjustly in trying to usurp the throne from Horus. In other myths, she uses her magical powers to fight and defeat Seth. Remember that Seth was often viewed as the archetype for any adversary to the pharaoh. An Isis mystery cult would also be developed that would become especially popular among the Greeks and Romans. And so there had been an important temple of Isis in the city of Philae that became a popular place of pilgrimage during Hellenistic and Roman times. And there were also numerous temples dedicated to her throughout the Greek and Roman realms. Well, as I said, the progeny of Isis and Osiris was Horus, and we saw how that birth came about. Now, as Horus grew to be a man, he had to contend with his uncle Seth. He had to fight with Seth, first of all, to avenge his father's death, but also to become the next king of Egypt. He also had to deal with Seth, trying to petition the gods to side with him over against Horus so that he could become the next pharaoh instead of Horus. But in the end, Horus was vindicated and crowned the successor to his father. Now you can see that Horus was depicted as having the solar disk on his head. Note that the disk is wrapped in a cobra. This cobra was what was known as the Uraeus. Okay, now there was a recognized connection between the god Horus and the reigning pharaoh. The living, reigning pharaohs were all identified as Horus. They were not identified as Osiris, the former king. He is now the god of the underworld, the god of the dead. Only dead pharaohs were identified as Osiris, and we saw this identification in one of those pyramid texts that we looked at earlier. All right, now there are a few important Egyptian myths that I'd like you to be aware of. In this first artistic work, the god Shu is stretching out the sky goddess Nut as an arched structure of some sort that separates the waters below from the waters above. And then reclining on the ground is Geb, the earth god. So this is evidently the depiction of some kind of creation myth, with the cosmos being depicted in terms of various gods and goddesses. Another important creation myth came from the city of Heliopolis. According to this myth, at the very beginning there was only one god, Atum. Naturally, he was the patron deity of the city of Heliopolis. Now, Atum was a sun god who was later assimilated with Ra. Heliopolis was actually the city of the sun. Helios in Greek means sun, polis means city. So it makes sense, perhaps, in a creation myth hailing from this city, for the sun god to be envisaged as the creator. And this raises an important point. Many Egyptian gods were originally local deities, patron gods of particular cities. But when Ra came to be recognized as the chief deity, or the king of the gods, or the creator, or whatever, everyone wanted to identify their own local deities with Ra. And so that's why we have all of these assimilations of various gods with Ra. Amun-Ra, Ra-Atum, Horus and Ra, and so on. Anyway, so according to this myth, Atum created the other gods. He was alone at the beginning, but then he created Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, Geb and Nut, earth and sky, and then the rest of the divine Ennead. The divine Ennead was like the council of the supreme gods. This divine council would meet together sometimes to deliberate over important matters, such as whether Horus or Seth should be the next successor to Osiris. Right, well, if you notice in this myth, each of the male gods after Atum has a female counterpart. Whether it's Tefnut, Nut, Isis, or Nephthys, each of the male gods has his female counterpart. And it's through sexual union that they create the next generation of gods. So you might be wondering how Atum managed to create the first generation of gods. It was through masturbation. Okay, moving on now to the Memphis creation myth. According to another myth from the city of Memphis, it was not Atum, but Ptah, who acted as the creator of the universe. Ptah was naturally the patron god of Memphis. So, as I just mentioned, people in the different cities of Egypt tended to see their own local gods as the most important, as the creator, the king of the gods, and so on. And that's why we've now got all of these competing myths about which god it was who created the world, whether Atum, Ptah, or someone else. Anyway, there you can see on the right, Ptah. He was depicted with a mummiform body, a goatee, and green skin. So he looks a lot like Osiris. He was also portrayed as standing on a pedestal. This was the symbol of Ma'at, justice. In his hand, he holds the Was scepter, a symbol of authority and power, as well as well-being and life. All right, so here is from the Memphite creation myth. The gods who came into being in Ptah. Ptah Nun, the father who made Atum. Ptah Naunet, the mother who bore Atum. So notice what's being said here. Creation is being taken back a notch from what was said in the creation myth from Heliopolis. Atum is recognized as being a very ancient god, but even he was created by Ptah Nun. That's the primordial water, which was the material from which Atum was said to have emerged. And so Atum is not the true creator, but Ptah is. Okay, and continuing, Ptah the Great is heart and tongue of the 9 gods, the gods of the Ennead. That's the divine council of 9 gods. There came into being as the heart, and there came into being as the tongue, something in the form of Atum. The mighty Great One is Ptah, who transmitted life to all gods and to their cause as well, through this heart by which Horus became Ptah, and through this tongue by which Thoth became Ptah. Thus all the gods were formed, and his Ennead was completed. Indeed, every word of the god really came into being through what the heart thought and the tongue commanded. Thus it was said of Ptah, he who made all and brought the gods into being. Now to me this sounds a lot like pantheism. Ptah was the original primordial waters, but he transformed himself into Atum and all the other gods. Notice that he does this through speaking. He speaks what's in his heart, and it comes into existence. And so some have drawn parallels between this creation account and the one that we have in the book of Genesis in the Bible, where God simply speaks and things come into existence. All right, continuing. He is indeed Tatenin. Tatenin is that mound of earth that first emerges from the primordial waters. I talked about that in the previous lecture. So Ptah is even this original mound of earth on which creation took place. He is indeed Tatenin, who brought forth the gods, for everything came forth from him, nourishment and provisions, the offerings of the gods, and every good thing. Thus it was discovered and understood that his strength is greater than that of other gods. And so Ptah was satisfied after he had made everything, as well as every word of the god. He had formed the gods, he had made cities, he had founded nomes, he had put the gods in their shrines, he had established their offerings, he had founded their shrines, he had made their bodies like that with which the hearts were satisfied. So the gods entered into their bodies of every kind of wood, every kind of stone, every kind of clay, or anything which might grow upon him, in which they had taken form. So all the gods, as well as their cause, gathered themselves to him, content and associated with the Lord of the 2 lands. That's Upper and Lower Egypt. Again, this sounds like pantheism. Ptah is in all the wood, stone, clay, everything. All right, so those were a few of the creation myths. Another type of myth sought to explain the sun god's daily journey through the sky. This picture is similar to the one that we saw earlier. The goddess Nut is being stretched out once again by Shu in order to form the heavens. But this isn't so much a mythological portrayal of creation. Here, Nut's body is depicted as being full of stars. That's because, according to this myth, the sun is journeying through the underworld on his bark, or ship. It's nighttime, in other words, and that's why the stars are visible. Once the sun completes his underworld journey, he'll be swallowed up by Nut and will be conducted through her body until the evening when she gives birth to him, and he journeys once again through the underworld. Every day this cycle is repeated, and that's why we have the sun during the day and stars at night. Here is a modern depiction of the same mythological scene. And here are some other ancient portrayals of the same mythological concept of the sun passing in and out of Nut, the sky goddess. And another mythological explanation for the sun's movements, one which was not necessarily different from the one just mentioned, envisaged the sun as Osiris's Ba, as it emerged from the netherworld and made its way across the sky each day until it descended once again to pass through the netherworld at night. Osiris, remember, is the deceased pharaoh, whose corpse is still in the underworld. Here in this image, I've tried to illustrate this myth visually. See how Osiris's corpse and mummy are located in the crypt beneath the pyramid? His Ba doesn't remain in this crypt, though. It traverses the sky each day. Now, a very important myth has been recorded by Plutarch, Remember, he was one of the classical authors that I mentioned. He wrote a book called Isis and Osiris, in which he recalls this lengthy myth about the king and how he was succeeded by his son Horus. And Plutarch was writing in probably the first quarter of the 2nd century, so maybe 100 or 110 AD, something like that. All right, so according to this myth, Osiris was originally a king of Egypt, a historical king, and his brother Seth seems to have envied him. So one day he threw a party and invited many people, including his brother Osiris. At the party, Seth displayed to the partygoers a beautifully constructed coffin, because this is what one does when one throws a party: show off the newly built coffin. Well, he declared that he would give this coffin to anyone who could fit inside of it. So everybody lined up, I want that coffin for my burial. So they tried to fit inside, sort of like in the story of Cinderella. Some people were too big, some people were too fat, too short, too thin, whatever. But when Osiris got inside, he fit perfectly. And this was, of course, because Seth had taken the measurements of his brother beforehand. So as soon as Osiris lay down in the coffin, Seth's henchmen closed and sealed it. Then Seth took and dumped the coffin into the Nile, and Osiris drowned. After drowning Osiris, Seth imprisoned Isis, Osiris's wife and sister. But Isis escaped by transforming herself into a bird. She then went out in search for her husband's body. She eventually found the coffin in Byblos, which is in modern Lebanon, and had his corpse brought back to Egypt, where she hid it in a field. One night, though, when Seth was out hunting by moonlight, he stumbled across the corpse and proceeded to hack it into 14 pieces. Other accounts will say different numbers, but anyway. He then scattered the pieces throughout Egypt. Well, Isis was deeply upset by this, so once more she transformed herself into a bird and went out in search of her husband's body parts, weeping as she went. After a long, diligent search, she managed to locate all the body parts except one. Can you guess which one? If you said his penis, you were correct. Seth had tossed this body part into the Nile, and a fish had eaten it. So Isis brought Osiris's body parts back together and fashioned a new phallus out of mud and clay. Again, as one does. She then had sex with the corpse, and in so doing collected some of Osiris's essence, that is, his semen. Now she gave birth to Horus in the bulrushes, where she also hid him from Seth until he was grown. And so you can see in some of these relief sculptures, Isis copulating with the reconstituted body of her deceased husband and conceiving their son Horus. Well, Horus is there on the left-hand side of the bed, so I'm not sure how that works exactly. But he was the child of this union. Here's another depiction. And here are some images of Isis with her baby Horus. This would have been a famous statue in the ancient world. Isis, remember, was the patron goddess of childbirth. She was often conflated with the goddess Hathor for that reason, and she was also seen as the archetypal mother. Well, when Horus came of age, it was his duty to avenge his father's death. He therefore engaged his uncle in a battle, and in this battle, Seth injured Horus's eye, or sometimes both of his eyes. Remember, one of Horus's eyes represented the sun, and the other one the moon. Horus, in turn, tore off the testicles of Seth. So it's kind of the ancient equivalent of a presidential debate. Now, this contest between Seth and Horus wasn't just about revenge. Seth and Horus were in a battle for kingship. Horus, you should understand, represented Lower Egypt, and Seth, Upper Egypt. So it's possible that the battle between these two mythological figures actually recalled a historical battle between the kings of the north and the south, with the king of the north, that is Lower Egypt, conquering the king of the south and unifying Egypt into a single empire. Well, the battle between Seth and his uncle was indecisive. So afterwards, Seth brought a charge before the divine Ennead, the great council of 9 gods. He claimed that Horus couldn't be the king because he wasn't legitimately conceived. He probably pointed out that Osiris had already died, so the only way that Isis could have had a child was through some other man. Isis, however, explained to the council how she had procreated with Osiris's dead body, and her sister Nephthys confirmed the story, and Thoth, too, declared that Isis was telling the truth. And so the divine council, what else could they do but decide in favor of Horus? After all, Isis had conceived Horus from the body of the previous pharaoh. This made him the rightful heir to the throne. And so Horus became the next pharaoh, ruling Lower Egypt in the place of his father Osiris and taking the kingdom from Seth in Upper Egypt as well. Now, there's another myth that I'd like you to read, the myth of the contendings of Horus and Seth. And I'll make that available to you through PDF or something like that. Another important idea in ancient Egyptian religion is that in the afterlife there would be a judgment of every individual. Here we see one of the most famous vignettes from the coffin texts, and it depicts the judgment in the afterlife. You can see a person's soul being weighed in the balance as it's being held down by only a feather on the opposite end. The feather represented Ma'at, justice. If the heart were found to be heavier than the feather, then it would be judged unjust and would be devoured by Ammit, the part croc, part lion, part hippo demon. And you can see Osiris over to the right-hand side presiding over the judgment. The god Anubis sits at the scale and declares the person just, or I guess unjust as well sometimes. And then Thoth is there to the right, recording the verdict. Once the verdict had been pronounced, Horus led the person to his father Osiris. And here's the same judgment scene in another vignette. This was apparently a stereotyped depiction of what happens in the afterlife. So people would have been familiar with this scene. To succeed in the judgment in the next world, one needed to attest to having never committed any wrongdoings. This implies some kind of recognized code of conduct, even if this code was not actually codified, in other words, written down. Because otherwise, how could you be judged by some code that you weren't even aware of? All right, so you had to affirm that you had not sinned against men. I have not sinned against men is what you would say. I have not oppressed or wronged my kinsfolk. I have not committed evil in the place of truth. I have not known worthless men. I have not committed acts of abomination. I have not done daily works of supererogation. Not sure what that means. In Christianity, a work of supererogation would be something good over and above what was required. But that can't be what the term means here, obviously. I have not caused my name to appear for honors. I have not domineered over slaves. That's kind of an interesting one. There's a couple in here about slaves, which it seems kind of surprising given the fact that, well, the pharaoh and a lot of the leaders in ancient Egypt would have had slaves and would have treated them quite badly, I'm sure. Look at number 12. I have not caused harm to be done to the slave by his master. I have caused no man to suffer. I have allowed no man to go hungry. I have made no man to weep. I have slain no man. I have not given the order for any man to be slain. Again, think about the pharaoh. Pharaohs must have given many orders for people to be slain, so this might seem like an unlikely law code for a pharaoh. But maybe pharaohs didn't have to go through this ordeal. Maybe this final judgment was for everyone else. After all, the dead pharaoh was identified as Osiris, who presided over the judgment. Okay, number 28. I have not cheated with the pointer of the scales. Back then, the way you would measure the value or the purity of a certain metal was by putting it on a scale. And so people would sometimes manipulate the scales or somehow make it so that the scale read the incorrect amount. I have not taken away the milk from the mouths of babes. I have not driven away the beasts from their pastures. I have not netted the geese of the preserves of the gods. So there were apparently some parts of Egypt where there were geese that were considered to be sacred to the gods, and you weren't allowed to catch any of those geese. I have not caught fish with the bait of their bodies, kind of an interesting taboo. I have not obstructed water when it should run. In a country that relied so much on the fresh water of the Nile and its tributaries, there was an understandable concern with people trying to dam streams and wadis. I have not cut a cutting in a canal of rating water. I have not extinguished a flame when it ought to burn. I have not abrogated the days of offering the chosen offerings. So you see, some of these are not just about morality, but about like religious rituals as well. I have not turned off cattle from the property of the gods. And then the last one, I have not repulsed the god in his manifestations. I am pure, I am pure, I am pure, I am pure. All right, in order to understand Egyptian religious practices and mythology, one really needs to understand the Egyptians' conception of death. In order to understand this, one first needs to understand a few things about Egyptian anthropology. Now, when I say anthropology here, I'm not talking about the discipline of anthropology that you might study at college. I'm talking about the Egyptian concept of man. In other words, what the Egyptians thought it meant to be a human being. And in particular, I'm talking about what the Egyptians thought were the essential components or aspects of the human being. Unlike what we find in other ancient cultures, Egyptian anthropology was quite elaborate. In some cultures, human beings were thought to be just a material body with a soul or spirit. The Egyptians, on the other hand, held that human beings consisted of a body, a shadow, a corpse, a heart, a ka, a ba, and perhaps some other things like a name or different kinds or aspects of the heart. Okay, so let's start with the ka. The ka was symbolized iconographically and hieroglyphically as a pair of upright arms, each held straight up like this, kind of like someone was saying, touchdown. Now here in this relief sculpture, we see the god Khnum creating a person's ka on the potter's wheel. Ka can perhaps be translated soul or spirit, twin, doppelganger, personality, and so on. It's kind of hard to translate because we don't have an exact equivalent in English. Anyway, the goal of an individual was always to align oneself with his or her ka, usually through proper or upright behavior. So you may have heard the expression, what would Jesus do? In ancient Egyptian religion, you would say, what would my ka do? And then you would try to act accordingly. For the Egyptians, the ka seems to have allowed the person to function properly. Without it, the body would malfunction or perhaps not function at all. A person therefore had to maintain a friendly relationship with his or her ka, both in this life and in the hereafter. To act contrary to one's ka could have dangerous repercussions, especially in the afterlife. During life, the ka remains united to the body. At death, however, all elements of the body, including the ka, become dissociated. If someone behaved according to his ka during this life, he would go to his ka at death. But if he misbehaved and acted contrary to his ka in this life, his ka might not recognize him in the afterlife. The person would therefore not be able to reunite with his ka. And this apparently meant that the person would be consigned to a non-functional, motionless, comatose state in the afterlife. Another important characteristic of the ka is that at death, it required nourishment. And this is why food and drink offerings were often made to the ka at the tombs. All right, and now the ba. The ba seems to have provided a person with consciousness both in this life and the next. It was represented as a bird, usually with a human head. Like the term ka, ba can be translated as soul, spirit, power, and so on. What seems to have distinguished the ka from the ba was the latter's freedom of movement. The ba could ascend to the sky and descend to the netherworld. The ka, by contrast, seems to have been mostly restricted to the mortuary temple area remaining perpetually in the vicinity of the mummified corpse. Here you can see a depiction of the Ba of Queen Nefertari. And here is the depiction of a Ba returning to its corpse. The return of the Ba to its corpse was essential for continued existence in the afterlife. And spells were used to prevent the Ba from losing its way as it journeyed through the underworld each night. Other spells were used to keep the Ba out of danger as it passed through this region. Remember we talked about Apophis and all the dangerous monsters and things that try to slay the Ba as it's journeying through the underworld. Now, you might want to think of the Ka and the Ba not as separate components of the person, but as different modes of existence. So maybe think about what you experience when you have a dream. Maybe your dream is a purely mental experience, but it's not like your brain can exist or function without your body or without your soul. Everything is still connected, even if the experience seems relegated to just one part of your body, like your brain. I don't know if that's a great analogy, but maybe you'll find it helpful for trying to grasp how exactly the Egyptians were conceptualizing things. Okay, now what about the body or the corpse? In ancient Egyptian thinking, the outer physical body contained all the person's recognizable features. As such, it represented the person in the afterlife. It was also through this body that the person would be able to speak, see, hear, and feel in the afterlife. And so I hope you can understand why the Egyptians mummified their dead. The dead person's continued existence or happiness in the afterlife depended in some sense on the corpse's preservation. Okay, and there was also the heart. The heart allowed the body to connect or interface with all the other elements. It was the heart rather than the brain that was seen as the seat of the intellect. It therefore contained the person's memory and kept an accurate record of everything that a person did in this life. That is something that is implied in this judgment scene where the heart is being weighed in the balance. Okay, and then we have the name. The Egyptians believed that a person was closely connected to and identified by his or her name, both in this life and in the hereafter. So a person's name needed to be preserved in writing even after he or she had died. If it were not, the person would cease to have an identity in the afterlife and would become an unrecognizable entity with no history, no family, no status, and so on. Then we have this sort of ambiguous concept of the shadow. Scholars aren't exactly sure how the shadow functioned, but it shows up in some of the vignettes and relief sculptures. It was depicted as a black figure of the deceased. Right, so you might think of all these different components in terms of a computer metaphor. The body or the corpse is kind of like the monitor, the tower, and the speakers. It's what you most readily identify as your computer. Without these, you wouldn't be able to see or hear anything that your computer is doing, and the computer itself would be useless. The Ka is kind of like a power box, providing the needed energy for the computer. The name is like your computer's serial number or IP address. The Ba is like your server and your connection to the internet, which allows you to visit different sites. Your heart is kind of like your operating system on your computer. It allows all of your programs to interface with one another. It's also kind of like your hard drive, which records everything that you've done on your computer. And then the shadow is, well, it's kind of like the shadow of your computer, I suppose. Okay, so now that you understand a little bit more about Egyptian anthropology, you will perhaps understand better why the mortuary cult was such an important idea. The goal of the Egyptian mortuary cult was to maintain a proper relationship between all the different elements or components of the human body, the corpse, the Ka, the Ba, the heart, and so on. No single element of the person could survive independently. So again, this is quite a bit different from what you find in other cultures. For example, in Greek culture, Many kind of viewed the body as something that we needed to get away from. The body, the soma, was the sema, the grave, and so we needed to break free from that. And then we could experience true life up in the ether or whatever. The Egyptians, by contrast, didn't believe that the physical body was ever disposable or unimportant. Even at death, a person's existence remained in some way dependent on the physical body. If the body decomposed, the person would evidently cease to exist. By preserving the body through mummification, the Egyptians thought that they were preserving the person's ongoing existence or well-being in the afterlife. Now you might be wondering, okay, so you mummify the body, but even after doing that, you're not going to be able to preserve it forever. Eventually it disintegrates or decomposes. And I'm not sure what the Egyptians did with that problem. Maybe they were just willingly oblivious to it. But at some point, you'd think that questions would have arisen. Okay, now, since at death, the various components of the person were disassociated with one another, the Egyptians came up with spells and rituals to bring those components back together. The most well-known of these rituals is that of the opening of the mouth. In this ritual, the deceased person's mummy was made to stand upright as a priest stretched out a long implement and inserted various things into it. Incense and amulets, for example. This ritual was supposed to help restore the different elements of the person, the ka, the ba, and so on, back to him or her. Because again, remember, at death, all of these things became disassociated from one another. And so this is from the pyramid text of Teti. Teti's mouth has been parted. Teti's nose has been opened. Teti's ears are unstopped. Teti will decide matters. He will judge between two. Teti will command one greater than he. Ra will purify Teti. Ra will guard Teti from all evil. We can see here that the opening of the mouth ceremony would help to restore the king's physical and mental powers, and this in turn would help him to function better as the judge and the ruler of the underworld. Here's another rendition of the opening of the mouth ceremony. Osiris Unis, I open for you your mouth. And then here's a directive to the priest, the divine metal from the south and the north. Unis, take the eye of Horus to which he went. I bring it to you, put it into your mouth. And then pellets of incense of the south and pellets of incense of the north. Apparently these are also put into his mouth. O Unis, take the stuk of Osiris, stuk pellets. I guess they didn't know how to translate that word. Take the tip of the bodily breast of Horus, take it into your mouth. Okay, now remember that the new pharaoh, the successor to the one whose mouth is now being opened, was identified mythologically as Horus. So it sounds to me like what's happening at this point in the ritual was the new pharaoh was placing his own nipple into the mouth of the mummy. Then apparently some milk from a jar was poured out onto the ground or perhaps into the mummy's mouth. I'm just guessing about this though, so take my commentary with a grain of salt. Okay, but continuing. Take the full breast of your sister Isis, bring it unto your mouth, and empty something jar. Here again, it sounds like Isis, in other words, the sister of the deceased pharaoh, or perhaps the sister of the new pharaoh, was placing her nipple into the mouth of the mummy, and then the milk was again being poured out onto the ground or into the mouth of the mummy. This is your libation, Osiris. This is your libation, O Unis. Once again, Unis, the dead pharaoh, is being identified as Osiris. To make a libation of the north, round about, coming from your son, coming from Horus. Here again, the new pharaoh is identified as Horus and seems to be involved in the ritual. So he apparently comes forward once more and says, I have come. I bring you the eye of Horus, so that your heart may be refreshed by it. I bring it to you, to carry you, to be under your soles. Take the efflux which comes out of you, that your heart may not be weary thereby. And then you need to say 4 times, take, the voices come for you. Take the eyes of Horus, the black and the white one. Seize them for your front, that they may brighten your face. Now, if a person was at death successful in maintaining the proper relationship between all of these different elements of the human being, he or she would become an Ak. That is, a person in a state of blessedness. And here is the hieroglyphic symbol for the Ak. It was a crested ibis, but in the vignettes it was often depicted as a mummy. Okay, that's the end of this lecture, so I hope now that you have a better understanding of what ancient Egyptian religion was all about.